The neon lights of the Las Vegas Strip blazed through the tinted windows of the tour bus as it pulled up behind Caesar's Palace. It was June 1985, and Jimmy Page, the legendary guitarist of Led Zeppelin, was in town for a rare solo performance. At 41 years old, Page was considered untouchable, a living deity in the pantheon of rock guitar. His riffs had defined a generation. Stairway to Heaven, Whole Lotta Love, Kashmir. These weren't just songs, they were monuments. Every guitarist who picked up an instrument in the 1970s had tried and failed to capture even a fraction of Page's mystical combination of blues mastery, Celtic mystery, and sheer sonic power. He had nothing left to prove to anyone. Then someone knocked on his dressing room door and told him that Ace Frehley was in the casino downstairs, drinking Jack Daniels at a blackjack table, and had sent up a message. The Space Ace wanted to jam. What happened in the next 3 hours would become one of the most closely guarded secrets in rock history, would force Jimmy Page to completely reconsider his understanding of what guitar mastery actually meant, and would reveal that the man behind the silver makeup had been hiding a musical philosophy so profound that even Led Zeppelin's architect hadn't fully grasped it. The mid-1980s represented a strange purgatory for rock's old guard. MTV had changed everything. Image now mattered as much as musicianship, maybe more. Hair metal bands with guys who'd barely learned to play were selling millions of records based on looks and production tricks. Meanwhile, the pioneers who'd built rock music into an art form were watching their cultural relevance slip away. Jimmy Page felt this acutely. Led Zeppelin had imploded 5 years earlier after John Bonham's death, and Page's attempts at solo work hadn't captured the magic. He was playing corporate gigs in Vegas now, prestigious but somehow diminished, trading on past glory rather than creating new legends. The audiences were respectful but distant, treating him like a museum piece rather than a living force. Ace Frehley was navigating his own crisis, though of a different kind. He'd left Kiss 3 years earlier in 1982, that devastating departure that had felt like abandoning a sinking ship and jumping into shark-infested waters simultaneously. His solo album in 1978 had been the biggest seller of all 4 Kiss solo releases, proof that the Space Ace could exist independently. But by 1985, he was drinking heavily, the grip of alcoholism tightening around his creativity like a python. He was in Vegas because Frehley's Comet, his post-Kiss band, had a club gig at a venue so small that security consisted of 1 bouncer and a metal detector that didn't work, from Madison Square Garden to a 300-capacity room off the Strip. That's what 3 years of bad decisions and worse habits had accomplished. But Ace Frehley, even drunk, even diminished, even playing clubs instead of stadiums, still had that thing. That indefinable quality that separated real musicians from technical players. And he was about to prove it to one of rock's untouchable legends. Jimmy Page's tour manager was a nervous man named Richard who'd worked in the industry long enough to recognize disaster before it happened. When he delivered Ace's message, his hands were actually shaking. "Mr. Page, there's a situation. Ace Frehley from Kiss is downstairs and he's been drinking, and he sent up word that he wants to challenge you to a guitar battle in front of whoever wants to watch. He said, and I'm quoting here, 'Tell Jimmy Page that the Space Ace can show him something about playing that Led Zeppelin never figured out.'" The words hung in the air of the dressing room like cigarette smoke. Page, who'd been reviewing his set list for that evening's performance, looked up slowly. His dark eyes, which had stared down stadium crowds and mystical experiences in Egyptian pyramids and Aleister Crowley's former mansion, narrowed slightly. "Ace Frehley said that?" Richard nodded miserably. "He's pretty drunk, sir. He's got a Gibson Les Paul with him at the blackjack table. Security doesn't know what to do. In any rational universe, Jimmy Page would have ignored the challenge. You didn't get to where he was by accepting provocations from drunken guitarists in casino bars. But something in the message intrigued him. Not the challenge itself, that was just alcohol talking. But the specific wording, something Led Zeppelin never figured out. What could Ace Frehley possibly know that Jimmy Page didn't? Page had studied blues masters in Mississippi Delta towns, had recorded in mobile studios in English manor houses, had pioneered guitar techniques that were now standard practice. He'd used a violin bow on guitar strings for God's sake. He'd recorded backwards guitar solos. He'd created some of the most iconic riffs in rock history using alternate tunings that other guitarists couldn't even conceptualize. And this makeup-wearing showman from a theatrical rock band thought he could teach Jimmy Page something? The curiosity alone was worth investigating. "Tell Mr. Frehley I'll be down in 20 minutes, Page said quietly. "And Richard, make sure there are no cameras, no press. Whatever happens down there, it stays private." The casino floor at Caesar's Palace in 1985 was a cathedral to excess. All marble columns and Roman statuary, and the constant electronic symphony of slot machines paying out jackpots to tourists who'd already lost twice what they'd won. Jimmy Page moved through it like a ghost, nobody recognizing the man whose face had once been on 1 billion album covers. He was dressed simply, dark jeans and a loose shirt, no rock star regalia. Just a man carrying a guitar case, looking for a drunk who wanted to make a point. He found Ace Frehley exactly where Richard had said he'd be, at a blackjack table near the back, a stack of chips in front of him and a tumbler of Jack Daniels, sweating condensation onto the green felt. The Gibson Les Paul, that iconic guitar that had been with Ace through Kiss's glory years and beyond, leaned against his chair like a loyal dog. Ace looked up when Page approached, and his eyes, though glassy from alcohol, still had that spark of something dangerous and intelligent. "Jimmy Page," Ace said, his voice carrying that distinct Bronx edge even after years of fame. "You actually came down." "You challenged me," Page replied, his British accent making the words sound more formal than the situation warranted. "I'm curious what you think I haven't figured out." Ace stood up, leaving his chips on the table, trusting that in Caesar's Palace nobody would be stupid enough to steal from someone who looked like trouble. He picked up the Les Paul, his movements surprisingly steady despite the alcohol in his system. "Not here," he said. "Too many people. You got somewhere we can plug in?" Caesar's had a small rehearsal space backstage at the main showroom, used by acts to warm up before performances. Page's tour manager had already arranged access, and 10 minutes later, the two guitarists stood in a room that smelled like old carpeting and decades of cigarette smoke, facing each other with two Marshall amplifiers humming between them. Ace plugged in his Les Paul. Page opened his case to reveal a 1959 Fender Telecaster, the guitar that had created some of Zeppelin's most iconic moments. They stood there, two men separated by ocean and style and reputation, connected by 6 strings and the strange alchemy that happened when electricity met wood and wire. "You want to know what Led Zeppelin never figured out?" Ace asked, his words only slightly slurred. "You never understood that less is more. You guys played everything like you were trying to fill up every second with sound. Robert Plant wailing, John Bonham hammering drums like he was trying to kill them, John Paul Jones playing bass lines that could be songs themselves, and you playing 1,000,000 notes per measure. It was impressive. It was huge. But you know what it wasn't?" Page waited, genuinely curious now despite himself. It wasn't spacious, Ace said. It wasn't empty. And empty is where the real magic lives. What happened next would become, in the years that followed, one of those moments that people who were there would describe with religious reverence, and people who weren't would claim they were. Ace Frehley, drunk and diminished, and playing in a rehearsal room instead of a stadium, proceeded to give Jimmy Page a master class in something the Led Zeppelin guitarist had somehow never fully understood. The concept of negative space. "Pick a riff," Ace said. "Any riff you want. Something simple." Page thought for a moment, then played the opening to Heartbreaker, that iconic descending chromatic run that every guitarist knew. He played it the way he'd always played it, fast and precise, each note articulated clearly, the technical mastery evident in every pick stroke. Ace listened, nodded, then held up a hand. "Now let me play it." What came out of Ace's amplifier didn't sound faster or more technical. It sounded emptier. He played the same riff, but between each note he left space, actual silence. Milliseconds of nothing that somehow made the notes that did sound hit harder. And when he bent the final note, he didn't just bend it and hold it like Page had. He bent it, released it slightly, bent it again, creating a wobble, a vocal quality that made the guitar sound like it was crying. The difference was subtle but devastating. Page had played the riff. Ace had made it mean something. "See, the thing about Kiss," Ace continued, his speech clearing somewhat as he focused on music. "Everyone thought we were all spectacle. The fire, the blood, the makeup, the flying. And yeah, that was part of it. But you know what made it work musically? We left room. Gene's bass lines were simple, leaving space for Paul's rhythm guitar. Paul played rhythm but left holes for me to fill with lead. Peter's drums were powerful but not busy. And my leads? I played the minimum number of notes necessary to convey the maximum emotion." He demonstrated, playing the main riff from one of his Kiss-era compositions, a song called Rocket Ride that had always been overlooked in favor of the band's bigger hits. Page listened and realized that Ace was right. Every note had room to breathe. The silence between notes was as composed as the notes themselves. "John Bonham understood this," Ace said, and there was respect in his voice when he mentioned Zeppelin's late drummer. "That opening to When the Levee Breaks? That's not just a drum fill, that's architecture. The space between each hit is what makes it massive. But you guys, you and Plant and Jones, you kept trying to fill every space with more. More notes, more vocals, more everything. And sometimes, Jimmy, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is shut the fuck up and let the silence talk." Page set down his Telecaster and sat on the arm of a broken couch in the corner of the rehearsal room. This wasn't what he'd expected. He'd thought Ace Frehley wanted to prove he could play faster or more complex passages. This was something different. This was philosophical. "Where did you learn this?" Page asked, and there was no condescension in the question, only genuine curiosity. Ace took a long drink from the glass he'd brought with him, the Jack Daniels probably the only thing keeping him standing at this point in his life. "Chicago, 1969. Before Kiss existed, before I was Space Ace, I was just Paul Frehley from the Bronx, playing guitar in bars, trying to figure out how to make people listen. And there was this old blues player, guy named Willie Johnson, probably nobody you've ever heard of, who was playing a residency at a club on the South Side. I watched him play 3 sets a night for a week. The memory seemed to sober Ace somehow. Or maybe it just focused him. Willie played a Gibson ES-335, And he maybe played 30 notes in an entire 3-hour set, but every single note made grown men cry into their drinks. I asked him how he did it, and he told me something I didn't understand until years later. He said, "Son, the notes you don't play are more important than the ones you do. Because the notes you don't play leave room for the listener to put themselves into the music. You play too many notes, you're just showing off. You play the right notes with the right space. You're creating a home where people can live." Page absorbed this, thinking about his own influences. The blues masters he'd studied, the folk traditions, the Eastern music that had influenced physical graffito. He'd always thought about filling space, about creating walls of sound that were impressive and overwhelming. But Ace was talking about something different. Creating absence. Creating negative space that made the positive space more powerful. "Show me more," Page said simply. For the next hour, Ace Frehley deconstructed his approach to guitar. He explained how the Space Ace character, the silver makeup and the smoking guitar, and the whole theatrical presentation was designed to hide the simplicity of his playing. Because if audiences saw how simple it was, they might not understand how hard it was to be that simple, to choose exactly the right note and no others. He played passages from his 1978 solo album, particularly the sections from his biggest hit, showing how he deliberately left spaces in the arrangement where other musicians would have filled with more guitars or keyboards. Those empty spaces created tension, created questions that the listener's brain wanted answered. He demonstrated his vibrato technique, that slight wobble he added to sustained notes, explaining that the wobble wasn't random. It was controlled, creating a wave pattern that the human ear interpreted as emotion. Too fast and it sounded nervous. Too slow and it sounded lazy. But at exactly the right frequency, it sounded like the guitar was singing, like it had a voice that was expressing something words couldn't capture. And he talked about his relationship with the Les Paul guitar, how he'd learned that the guitar itself wanted to sound a certain way, and fighting against that natural voice was pointless. You had to learn what the instrument wanted to say and then help it say that, rather than forcing it to say what you wanted. Page listened and realized that Ace Frehley, this drunken guitarist from a band that critics had dismissed as cartoonish, understood something about the fundamental nature of musical communication that Page had somehow missed in all his mystical studies and technical mastery. "Play me something," Ace said finally, settling back against the amplifier with his drink. "Play me something that means something to you. Not something technical. Not something to impress me. Something true." Jimmy Page picked up his Telecaster and for a long moment just stood there thinking. In his career with Led Zeppelin, he'd always been the architect, creating complex structures that showcased every musician's abilities. But Ace was asking for something different, something vulnerable. He started playing, and what came out wasn't a Zeppelin riff or a complex composition. It was a simple blues progression, 3 chords, nothing fancy. But he applied everything Ace had just taught him. He left space between notes. He let silence speak. When he did play a note, he bent it with feeling rather than precision, let it wobble with emotion rather than technical perfection. And for the first time in years, Jimmy Page felt like he was actually communicating something real rather than demonstrating ability. When he finished, Ace was nodding slowly. "There it is. That's the thing. That's what makes people remember a performance 30 years later. Not because you played a million notes, because you played the right 10 notes and made them matter." They played together for another hour, trading ideas, Ace showing Page how to use negative space to create dynamics, Page showing Ace some alternate tunings that could open up new harmonic possibilities. Two masters from different worlds, finding common ground in the spaces between sounds. At some point, Page's tour manager knocked on the door, reminding him that he had a performance in 2 hours and needed to prepare. Page looked at his watch, startled to discover how much time had passed. "This conversation," he said to Ace, "it changes some things for me." Ace smiled, that crooked smile that had been hidden behind Space Ace makeup for so many years. "That's the thing about guitar, Jimmy. You never stop learning. You stop learning, you start dying. And I may be drinking myself to death, but I'm not dead yet." Jimmy Page performed that night at Caesar's Palace, and people who were there said something was different. His solos had space in them, moments of silence that made the notes that followed hit harder. He wasn't trying to fill every second anymore. He was composing with absence as much as presence. The reviews the next day called it a revelation, said that Page had somehow found a new maturity in his playing. Nobody knew about the drunk guitarist in the rehearsal room who'd taught him how to use emptiness as an instrument. Ace Frehley went back to the casino floor and lost all his chips at blackjack, then stumbled back to whatever cheap hotel he was staying at, the cycle of addiction pulling him under once again. But for one night, for 3 hours, he'd been the teacher, and one of rock's legends had been the student. In the years that followed, Jimmy Page would occasionally mention in interviews that his approach to guitar had evolved, that he'd learned to appreciate space and silence as much as sound. He never mentioned Ace Frehley by name, honoring that private moment, keeping it as something personal rather than public. But musicians who knew, who'd heard whispers about what happened in Vegas in 1985, they understood. The lesson had been passed from one master to another, transcending ego and reputation and commercial success. Ace Frehley's own career took years to stabilize. He'd fight with alcoholism through the rest of the 1980s, the battle that nearly killed him multiple times. Frehley's Comet would have moderate success, nothing compared to Kiss, but enough to prove he could exist independently. And eventually, in the 1990s and 2000s, he'd get sober, would return to Kiss for reunion tours, would find peace with his legacy as Space Ace. In his autobiography years later, Ace would write one paragraph about meeting Jimmy Page in Las Vegas. He didn't give details, didn't name drop or claim credit for anything. He simply wrote that he'd had a conversation with one of the greatest guitarists who ever lived, and that they'd discussed the importance of what you don't play being as important as what you do play. Those who knew the real story understood what he was talking about. The guitar has 6 strings. This simple fact unites every guitarist who's ever lived, from blues players in Mississippi Delta juke joints to rock gods in stadiums. What separates the great from the merely good isn't how many notes they can play, or how fast they can play them. It's understanding that those 6 strings can create sound, but they can also create silence, and both are equally powerful tools. Jimmy Page learned this from Ace Frehley in a backstage rehearsal room in Las Vegas. He learned that the mystical power he'd been seeking through Aleister Crowley's writings and Eastern philosophy and studio experimentation had been available all along in something simpler. The spaces between notes, the silence that makes sound meaningful, the emptiness that gives presence its power. Ace Frehley knew this instinctively, learned it from Willie Johnson and years of playing to audiences who didn't care about technical mastery, who just wanted to feel something real. The Space Ace makeup and the smoking guitar and all the theatrical elements of Kiss were designed to hide the simplicity of his approach, because simple is often mistaken for easy. And what Ace did wasn't easy at all. Choosing exactly the right note and knowing when not to play anything requires more discipline than playing everything you can possibly play. The night in Vegas stayed private, became one of those rock and roll moments that exists more in whisper than in documentation. No cameras captured it, no journalists wrote about it, no official record exists of Ace Frehley challenging Jimmy Page and then teaching him something fundamental about music. But the musicians knew. Word spread through that network of players who understood that sometimes the most important lessons come from unexpected teachers in unlikely places. That the guy in the makeup might know something the mystical genius didn't. That being drunk and broken doesn't mean you don't have wisdom to share. Jimmy Page continued his career with a new understanding of space and silence. Ace Frehley continued his struggle with demons, personal and chemical, but never lost his understanding of what made music connect with human hearts. And somewhere in the history of rock guitar, in that lineage that runs from blues masters through British invasion through arena rock and beyond, there's a moment in Las Vegas where two masters met, and the one everyone expected to teach learned from the one everyone expected to need teaching. Because the guitar is just 6 strings, but what you do with those strings, what you choose not to do with those strings, that's where the magic lives. In the spaces between sounds, in the silence that speaks louder than noise, in the emptiness that creates fullness. That's the lesson Ace Frehley taught Jimmy Page. And through Page, that lesson continues to echo through every guitarist who understands that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all.